I just want to first of all say good morning and thank you all so much for being here for the Decommissioning California Refineries and Beyond workshop. As I did mention a little bit earlier, this session will be recorded and notes will be available afterwards. Just in case you miss anything and want to go to another session, the information will be made available to you. Just to introduce myself, my name is Yusra Arub. I am currently an urban studies major at UC Berkeley, and I had the honor of also moderating the city planning and housing workshop just this past July. So I'm really, really excited to be back and inspired by this incredible turnout this morning. And I can't wait to engage in conversation with our panelists and all of you. And just to emphasize that this is a conversation, so please, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, which I will be monitoring. And yeah, this is going to be definitely an exciting workshop to be a part of. So we're really looking forward to hearing your views on a number of topics, and I want to direct your attention to these two links, which I will go ahead and drop in the chat shortly. The first one is a questions and action items handout, which will have the agenda laid out for you all, and as well as a survey that hopefully you will have the chance to fill out before the end of this workshop. So give me 1 second and I will drop those links in the chat for all of you. All right, so the first one is the questions and action items handout, as I mentioned earlier, and feel free to access that right now so you kind of have an overview of what today's workshop is going to look like. Our goal really by the end of today's workshop is ultimately to identify key action items that the cities, counties, and this region can take to address the climate crisis in relation to pollution that is caused by oil refineries here in the oil state of California. We want to understand this issue in relation to the rates of unemployment, as well as the increased usage of polluting fuels in very vulnerable communities here in the Bay Area. So thank you again for being here, and we really do hope that this isn't the last time we meet and we stay connected. Right, so I'm really excited to introduce our panelists today. First of all, we have Greg Karras, who is an independent consultant with more than 35 years of experience in the energy sector pollution prevention analysis. He was a senior scientist at Communities for a Better Environment and has served as an expert for CBE and other public sector organizations on hundreds of projects. And he is the author of a new report called Decommissioning California Refineries, Climate and Health Paths in an Oil State. And it was really great to hear from you this morning, Greg, so I'm excited to hear more from you today. Next, we have Claire Brown. She is an economics professor at UC Berkeley, where she teaches and studies how to create a sustainable, just economy that shares prosperity. Her book, Buddhist Economics, and her student research teams demonstrate policies used by countries to create an economy that cares for all people and the planet. Next, we have Steve Gary, who is a retired refinery worker of 25 years at Shell and Tesoro refineries in Washington. He was the president of USW Local 12591 from 2010 to 2015. And since retiring, he has served on the executive committee of Washington State Blue-Green Alliance and the steering committee, the Climate Alliance for Jobs and Clean Energy. All right, so I'm really excited once again to hear from all of you, and yeah, Greg, you can take it away.
I'm just going to jump right in, save plenty of time for discussion. So if you have questions about background and didn't make the opening plenary where I gave the background, we can get to that after the presentations. So here's a brief overview of the research report. California communities host the dominant oil refining center in Western North America. Mountains largely isolate it from other US refining centers. It refines 3 times the crude extracted in the state, makes that oil burnable in transport and industry, and exports refined fuels across the West Coast and the Pacific Rim. Well to wheel, the oil refined here emits more carbon than all other activities in the state combined. This chart shows cumulative emissions because that is what drives climate impact. It assumes all non-petroleum emissions meet state climate targets. Total statewide emissions would still exceed the red line shown soon, and by a lot. How much depends on whether refiners switch to higher or lower carbon oil. That's plausible, but even if they rebuild for the average US crude slate and do much more to get their carbon intensity down, they only go from where they are now, scenario S1 in the chart, to the black line below it labeled scenario S4. The red line is the climate limit defined by state climate targets through 2050. It reflects the state's share of global carbon cuts to between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. So this shows that even if we do everything else, we must refine less oil if we hope for a livable climate. California is no exception to the global consensus about that. Cumulative emission impacts force steeper refining cuts to meet our climate limit if we delay. This example shows that for 2 annual refining cut trajectories with no change in the carbon intensity of oil. The black curve waits until 2029, while the green curve starts in 2021. Both of these trajectories meet the climate limit by 2050 because the difference in cumulative emissions before the trajectory lines cross is the same as the difference after they cross. But the delay forces cutting refining rates much more each year in order to meet that 2050 limit. So this shows in sort of visual terms the emissions impact, the unescapable problem of if you delay, it gets harder. And if more refining capacity is lost in a year to make those deeper rate cuts, more of the community's oil-dependent tax and jobs base needs to be replaced with sustainable alternatives that fast. That's what I mean by harder. We have to rebuild our economy, and we have to rebuild our economy in real time. And if we fall behind, we face serious transition impacts or break our climate, or both. So this is really crucial and really urgent, and climate science needs to communicate it better. To help me out here, everybody, imagine you're in a car heading for a cliff. It matters when you put on the brakes. The increase in transition impact potential with delay is shown by the height of the black, red, and orange bars in this chart. The black bars are the likely case with no change in carbon intensity, but the worst case shown in red is still plausible. Note the 20% mark. Few, if any, California communities that host refineries have grown their economy 20% per year lately. So this is the transition feasibility and climate protection feasibility crisis that's coming to us soon if we fail to act now. What if we do? What if we start now and give ourselves the time we need to gradually retire and replace refining capacity here, to decommission refineries? No one is saying it's going to be easy, just that we can. We can rebuild 4 to 7% of the oil-dependent tax and jobs base annually with transition support. And the fundamental economics that make jobs rich, just transitions possible are clear, as these census data show. These are US Census Bureau data. But again, that's if we decommission refining capacity gradually by starting now. We can start now without risk to Californians' fuel supply, because the refiners' huge exports also are a huge cushion. In fact, the cushion is more than we need to start now and decommission refining gradually. It's much more with the telecommuting and the cheaper electric cars that are coming. Those two things, what we can do and will do next to switch fuels in transportation sector, that's not reflected by these figures. These are, if we did nothing about that, we'd still have years. So like I said, the cushion is pretty big. And refining for export here worsens pollution in frontline communities. It's a severe environmental injustice. And since California refineries are locked into high carbon crude on average, addressing that injustice here also reduces the carbon intensity of oil globally. On the other hand, keeping some of this export cushion might smooth transitions for refinery workers in some of our communities. Different communities have different transition opportunities and needs. Just transitions require broad support and community-based, community-driven, community-specific decision-making. So that's the big truth this research is about. We need to talk about how we're going to break free from our toxic relationship with oil before it takes us over a cliff. All of what I said and more is documented in this new research report. Here's how to get it. And the same link is at the bottom of each slide I'm showing. You might ask how COVID-19 affects all this. I did. It has not bought us time in our climate crisis. Its side effect on emissions is weak so far. These are in the numbers on it for California's petroleum sector. So the emission effect it's only going to be a blip, the emission effect of COVID, until and unless we find a way to make deeper ongoing emission cuts sustainable. Meanwhile, oil companies are reacting to side effects of the crisis in our total environment, and the COVID crisis is part of that. They're reacting now by launching some sudden transitions that threaten to be unjust and therefore unsustainable. This shows how a side effect of the pandemic drove unprecedented sudden losses in refining, in the productivity of California refining assets. You can see the vertical blue line, that's when the statewide order was issued. And these are weekly data from this year. Interesting in a lot of ways, but let me just be quick about it. The global pause in personal travel tanked refining rates when there was nowhere to sell or store so much gasoline and diesel. That's unsustainable. Of course, this is not a sustainable solution that we're in right now. But how this happened further reveals how our health, economy, and energy system intertwine. So we can learn from it to plan our just transitions. And it's at least coincident with a growing threat to local taxes and jobs, an immediate threat that calls for action now. End of last month, Marathon announced the immediate permanent closure of its Martinez refinery. Last week, August 12th, Phillips 66 announced plans to close its Rodeo carbon plant and Santa Maria refinery in 2 to 3 years as part of a biofuel switch at the Rodeo refinery. collectively, these closures and the consequent potential local tax losses threaten many hundreds of jobs in the refineries and outside the plants in our communities. Suddenly abandoning oil refineries is the opposite of gradually shifting from oil to sustainable tax and jobs bases. This is what an unplanned transition could look like. We're about to live that now unless we act. So we have some specific suggestions for immediate actions the task force could take in response to this emergent threat. We'll come back to this in a few minutes, but just to summarize, we need to acknowledge that we need to start now and why it's the absolute best time. All sorts of really important things flow from that, policy-wise and otherwise. It's about time that each of our communities counted up. So how much oil dependence do we have and whose jobs? How many teachers? That's how you start planning about it. And don't we all wish that Marathon had put the money up front to clean up not just the dirt, but people's lives before they closed? Well, it's not too late. So I'll just summarize with 3 reasons to ensure just transitions for workers and communities in the oil belt. Environmental justice demands this. The feasibility of a livable future climate may depend on this, and it's not too late.
Thank you very much, Greg. That was really informational, and we did have a question in the chat, but I think it would be great if we can keep the questions coming in the chat, and then there will be time for an audience Q&A. So if anything does come up, please feel free to let us know. But thank you once again, Greg, for that. And next up, I think we can go ahead and Claire, if you'd like to get started.
And now I will share my screen. There, how's that?
Nice.
Okay. So first of all, I want to thank everyone that's here because it means we all know that together we can follow what Greg is telling us in his terrific report, that we can decommission the refineries and we need to do it soon. And hey, I live in Point Richmond, not far from the Chevron refinery, and the air pollution that's caused by their continually flaring is really, really hard on the nearby communities. And the kids are especially suffering. So let me just step back for a minute as an economist and say, let's talk about sort of the economic foundations for why we absolutely need to eliminate fossil fuels and do it soon in California. Not just the consumption of fossil fuels where the state's really focused, but we've got to eliminate the production of fossil fuels, which means all the oil and gas operations and the refineries. And so I love how Greg showed us where sooner we do it, the easier and less costly it will be. So we have these 2 acute crises that are taking a lot of our attention right now, the pandemic and the economic collapse. But you know, the historical crises are ongoing and are really the ones that we need to continually focus on, of racism, climate emergency, and inequality. And the problem is that we absolutely have to focus on fossil fuels because they've been killing the planet, and we've got to stop our addiction to them, and we know we can. So as an economist, I can assure you that you're right. The neoliberal free market economics has provided the foundation for all of these interrelated crises, and we can do better. We want to rebuild our economy to create sustainability. We need to not only protect, but we are going to have to heal the planet. We want to share prosperity and be inclusive and equitable. And we want to ensure racial justice for all people. And this requires that we end the carbon economy and we restructure the economy to care for all people and the planet. And a lot of people say, okay, well, you know, neoliberal free market economics is bad, but is there another way? And I can assure you that we do know all the policies to stop the human domination of natural resources that's killing the planet, and have share prosperity and have justice for all. So how do we do this? Okay, so we look at the social democracies who are already practicing these policies. So Joe Stiglitz, Nobel laureate, already taught us how countries choose their inequality. And the US has chosen a very high inequality path, but other countries haven't, and we can learn from them, all the way from the Northern European social democracies to Japan, who have much lower levels of inequality. And so that we know we can do that, but we also know that we choose our greenhouse gas emissions. And so the climate scientists have provided us with roadmaps to transition to carbon-free energy, as well as regenerative agriculture and clean water. But today we'll focus on fossil fuels for right now. And we also know from the UN Millennium Development Goals that rich countries can also reduce global suffering. We learned how we can work together to educate women and girls, reduce global hunger and poverty. So we can do all those things. We know how to do it, even if we're not doing them in the United States. So to do this, we know government has to play a really big role. And let me just quickly remind you, the government role actually has to, we know the government has to provide the public goods and services for everyone that we all need. And you know the list as well as I do: healthcare, education, food, shelter, clean water, childcare, a rigorous safety net, which we're really aware of now, human rights, rule of law, and livable communities. But the government also, besides providing goods and services for all people, we definitely also have to regulate and incentivize stopping greenhouse gas emissions, because otherwise we can't do away with fossil fuels. And then third, the government must structure markets. And we can see how you can do it in the social democracies, where the government structures markets for the common good, or we can do it like we do in the US, where we so-called deregulate markets, which just means turning the rules over to big companies, big business, so that they can earn bigger profits and also big CEO pay. So let me just give you one quick example, because we care enormously about jobs and the just transition. So one of the ways that you structure the labor market is that you ensure good minimum wages, that you ensure paid leave, that you ensure a balanced family work life with decent hours of work for people, and that you have strong unions with worker power, and you ensure the health and safety of the workers. And the government does that through their regulations of the labor market. So we know our goal is to support the good life for all people, but to do that, we absolutely have to have the health of the planet be our top priority, and we don't have many years left to stop carbon emissions. So what we want to do is we know from our experience that we can work together to create the change. We know the path. So what we know also as activists, that we've got to have the political will and courage. And we can do this at the city and county level to start working to decommission refineries, stop oil and gas production in California. And so I want to thank you all, especially for all you're doing with the Climate Emergency Mobilization Task Force. And I look forward to our breakouts, where we really are going to talk about how can we take the actions that Greg has mentioned, and how can we do it together to make a big difference. And so I'm happy to answer any questions about economics, of course, but mainly I'm really here to join with you to decommission the refineries. And especially, I can't wait to lock up the Chevron refinery or have it be doing something totally different that's healthy for the community and the planet. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Claire. That was a wonderful presentation, and I'm genuinely excited for our conversation. I have been kind of keeping track of the questions, but I'd love to hear from Steve next, and then we can get into it.
I also thank everyone for participating. You folks there are speaking about the right kinds of things in the right kinds of communities, and you're doing it in communities I understand. I also live in refining communities. I've worked in refining communities in Northwest Washington, where 4 of Washington State's 5 refineries are. And I want to give you kind of a, if I can, a very quick and high elevation look at the way some within organized labor, and particularly the leaders of organized labor, think about these issues related to transition and to justice. You've heard a little bit about my background. I need to start by saying that I do not speak for the United Steelworkers, though I used to speak for local workers here. I do not speak for Blue Green Alliance or for the Climate Alliance. I speak today as a citizen, as a retired refinery worker who has some experience with these issues, and I have some experience with how, particularly the leadership within some elements of organized labor, particularly in industrial unions like the steelworkers, how they think about these issues. So I'll start by saying that we recognize, I think, a convergence of at least 3 separate realities, all converging and making this discussion so important. There is the environmental reality. We know, of course, that we must transition away from fossil fuels as quickly as possible. There is as a result, a political reality growing, particularly on the West Coast, for majorities of voters insisting that leaders do something about this. I can tell you that in Washington State, where quite a bit of money was spent on polling 2 years ago in an attempt to get a carbon fee initiative passed in Washington State, something that I was personally involved in, we found out that even in the most conservative rural counties in Washington State, there was a majority of citizens who recognized that climate change was real and that it was human caused and that we needed to do something about it. It began to break down when we talked about exactly what to do about it. But nonetheless, I think the political reality for change and for manage this change is there. The difficult part comes with the third reality, which is economic reality. As other speakers have mentioned, refining communities have benefited from that activity, from the high wages, the taxes, the fees, and other things that support public budgets for decades. And the potential economic harm that can come from catastrophic job loss if we can't manage this transition from one to another is very real. At the same time, another aspect of economic reality driving this transition is the economic fact that renewable energy, the solution, is cheap, and it's getting cheaper all the time. And it's no longer intermittent. Energy storage now means that renewable, clean electricity can be made available whenever we need it. We live in a market-based economy where price is paramount. And so it becomes, particularly for refinery workers and those who care about them, people like me, it doesn't even matter what you think about the environment, frankly, or politics. This transition is happening. And your jobs are on the line. And your community's economic well-being is also on the line. So it compels us all to identify as many shared values and concerns as possible in order to ensure justice. You folks in this report talk about decommissioning. I think of it a little bit differently. I think of it in terms of feed rates, how much crude they're pushing through these plants. I know from experience that the refiners look at their markets on a daily or at least weekly basis, and they adjust feed rates in response. If they think supply is too great or prices are too low, they cut feed. If they think there's profits to be made, they increase feed if they can. And the important thing here is they can actually run these plants at significantly reduced feed rates, far below their capacity, for extended periods of time if they choose to. The question is whether they will. We've got a situation here now, of course, where the transition has begun. We don't know if it's going to be justice in it. And we can talk about justice a little bit, I hope, in the Q&A, because justice looks different depending on your perspective. Justice for a refinery worker looks different than justice for a member of a frontline community, or justice for someone else in the community who's worried about, say, budgets, whether the roads get fixed, whether public health is sustained, all that sort of thing. So justice is a matter of perspective. But I will end here, or at least I want to get the Q&A because I think that's where the value is. I want to point out a couple of things that I know for a fact that the refining industry, a couple things that they look at first in response to what I call demand destruction, where demand for their products is reduced and they're afraid it will be reduced significantly over time. One of the first things they want to do is what Marathon just did in Martinez. They want to turn the plant into a terminal. That means about 90% of the hourly workforce gets put in the unemployment line. That decision turns the whole cost-benefit equation upside down. In a terminal operation, the economic benefit is retained by the corporation, while the environmental and economic costs are then borne by the community. It's important for refining communities to try to prevent that from occurring. And it can be done, particularly with policy, regulations and the like, comprehensive plan language, permitting language, that creates incentives to actually run the plant at reduced rates instead of simply shutting the process units down. The other thing that you'll see these refiners do, the best example in this country is probably what's happened in Philadelphia over the past year. Philadelphia Energy Solutions suffered a massive explosion and fire because they didn't maintain the place properly, and then declared bankruptcy. Bankruptcy now allows those owners to not only walk away from their environmental cleanup costs, but also walk away from their obligations to support their workforce's pensions and other kinds of financial obligations that benefit the whole community. So there are things I think that can be done to create incentives for refiners, not necessarily to physically throttle their plants, but to run the plants at reduced throughput to meet the markets they have, even though they're not necessarily the markets they want. And I think communities need to look very carefully at what they can do to achieve those goals. I will point out, just to finish here, where I live in Northwest Washington, Whatcom County in the northwest corner of the state has been, we're at the end of a 5-year process now to amend comprehensive plan language for an industrial area where the 2 refineries are. And the amendment says they're now written would prohibit what's called transshipment. We want to prevent hazardous material like crude oil and other feedstocks from entering that industrial area unless it's meant to be processed in that industrial area. We're trying to impose conditional use permitting for other kinds of proposed projects, particularly around biofuels or anything that could increase capacity for the refiners. And we want to fast track any kind of permitting necessary to keep the plants as safe and as efficient as possible. We think those kinds of things create incentive to run the plant instead of to shut it down. Those are all considerations in addition to the risk bonds and the other kinds of financial ideas that might create an incentive. So I think with that, I'll be done. I'm eager for the Q&A. So let's go there, I guess. Your discretion.
Sounds amazing. Thank you to our wonderful panelists for sharing that very valuable insight, and I'd love to get into the questions. Please feel free to utilize the raise hands feature as well if you would like to speak up and ask the question yourself. I think one of the first questions is back to Greg, your presentation. You mentioned the cushion idea, and someone asks that cushion idea seems dependent on cooperation from refinery operators. So can we rely on that?
No. It's, I mean, I agree with just about everything Steve Gary just said about this, but, you know, to be a little more simplistic about it, they're in it for the profits. They're trying to maximize the profits.
That's right.
if the particular refine, and it's usually a refinery by refinery basis around here these days. So if the refinery can profit more by exporting some fuel, they'll do that. If they can't, and you know, the COVID lockdown is a really good example of that. California's refineries export like crazy, but they have to have a market. And it was a pandemic, global. Demand dropped everywhere. They didn't, and one of them shut down, and another one's thinking of it. Those are not decisions about our health, I don't believe.
Can I put my 2 cents worth in?
Absolutely.
I agree. The risk facing refinery communities today, again, goes beyond environmental. It goes, right? It is an economic risk, and it's part and parcel of losses in industrial manufacturing capacity that we've suffered in this country for decades. Everything from pulp and paper to aluminum to steel and a host of other basic industrial manufacturing industries have moved their production capacity increasingly offshore. And they haven't done that because they can't make money producing those products in this country. They've done it to make more money elsewhere. $1 billion isn't enough. They want 2 or 3. That's why they do this. So decisions about how to manage this transition, how to protect what we have while also building what we need, can't be left to the corporations. It can't. That's why communities have to step up to create incentives or roadblocks in order to better ensure that there is justice in communities.
Yeah, I agree the communities have a big role to play, but I also understand the problem with the local tax base that we get. I know it well in Richmond from Chevron, and the negotiations the city council's always doing with Chevron for the tax so-called contribution. But that's where the role of the state comes in, because the state actually can help with regulations about how much refineries need to pay as they do decrease their feedstock, and also how much refineries need to, they can help with the negotiations for what you do with workers with early and full retirement, and in other areas where the state can actually step in and give some backbone to the city and help the city figure out how with taxes from the fossil fuel industry that aren't now, we rethink the taxes that we get from them. The big refineries have enormous amounts of money, and it's not like we can ignore that. We aren't talking about mom and pop stores that are going out of business, and we need to rethink sort of what can the state do, what's their role, what do the counties and cities need from the state to help them with this just transition. And also what we're talking about is Greg points out, we're talking about how does the state replace gradually money from the fossil fuel refineries to other sources, but we can do that over a long period of time with the fossil fuel industry still helping to pay the city, but calling it under a different form and with some negotiation. No, we need negotiation help from the state at the city level.
Great, thank you so much. Our next question is regarding the P66 decision. Someone asks, does that decision mean that they will no longer pursue building a new Bay Area terminal for larger tankers?
That's one of the first questions. And, you know, the short answer is we don't know yet, for sure. What Phillips 66 said is, and they put it in writing, is that if they get permits to switch to about 50,000 barrels per day of soybean oil refining for biofuel, for subsidized biofuel, then they will stop refining crude at that facility completely. But they said it in writing in a press release. It's not signed in blood. Plans change, and I'll refer to the discussion that Steve, Gary, and I just agreed about, what their real motivations are.
All right, great. We can move on to the next question, which is more specific to the Contra Costa County. Someone asks, how can we get the Contra Costa County to get the refineries to the table to discuss the decommissioning report?
Yeah, let me take a first stab at this. I think that my take on this is that the serious answer to that question comes from all of us. It's what we need your collective wisdom about. And I'm going to make a pitch for talking about this a little bit in your breakout groups and see what you can come up with. Look at the second and third suggestions that we've made. The second one is each local community figure out, quantify your unique situation. How much of your tax base, how much of your jobs base, and whose jobs need to transition? That starts the planning. And starting the planning, it also supports figuring out how much money and where to get it from. So the other one is just transition bonds. Put the money up front. I want to give you two examples of this. One is really recent. It's just this month. I spoke with, by the way, Steve, I spoke with Dave Campbell down at 675 yesterday about it. And it's real. They just wrote to the state, and with respect to oil wells, all of the thousands of abandoned wells that are being abandoned and have been abandoned because, in fact, extraction has dwindled in California. It's already phasing itself out. That's just natural limits. And they said, look, we need a just transition from oil, and you need to clean these up, and the company should pay for it. And so that's happening, that's playing out right now in the oil fields. 6 years ago, last time Chevron wanted a really big permit for a really big project expansion in Richmond, the Planning Commission voted unanimously to include a permit condition that would have put tens of millions of dollars of Chevron's money into a fund that would be spent up over time for a just transition. That did not survive when Chevron appealed it to City Council. And that's so it's an older example, and it also shows that we need to do the organizing to build the power to make it stick. I think that's probably part of the answer.
I can add just a little bit. I think the way you get the oil companies to the table is by actually going through the process of rewriting some of the underlying regulations, codes, permitting language, all the rest of it, that would limit their ability to do whatever they want. They've enjoyed, for the most part, the ability to do whatever they want for decades. And they will say and do anything they have to in order to try to maintain that right. But when they feel that they're going to have to play ball, that's how you get them at the table. And you do so by organizing your folks, understanding the legal landscape, the regulatory landscape, and being prepared to do what it takes to make sure the community has a say in how those plants are managed. Then they will come to the table. From my own experience here in Whatcom County, Washington, I mentioned before, the refiners basically ignored, for the most part, at least publicly, tended to seemingly ignore what the county council and the planning commission wanted to do. They didn't get serious about taking part in meaningful discussions about this language until just a year ago. And now we're 5 years into the process, and we're very close to getting something enacted, probably early next year. So you can get them to the table, but it's by communities taking matters into their own hands to protect themselves.
Right, yeah, and of course you can get them to the table with some regulations, as you said, which is really critical. But let me also say, in Richmond, one of the things we learned from the so-called contribution from Chevron each year, that's what they call it. It's a contribution. It's not actually a tax. And what we've learned is actually the contribution, which is millions of dollars, and the city needs it, but it's actually a pittance of the social cost to our schools, our communities, our kids' health. And so what Chevron's contribution doesn't even cover the social cost, especially in health, of the surrounding community. And so we also want to remember that when we're talking about the cost to the community, we do care about the jobs, of course, but we also care about the public health, especially of our kids and our elders. And once we bring that in, a lot of the costs that the city's bearing already, many of them will go down. And so we want to rethink in a very clever way, where do we get the money from the fossil fuel industry, from the refineries, as they shift production or close down? What money do we need? Where do we get it? And what's the transition from using them for community funding to other sources?
Great, sounds great. So the next question is kind of a mix of both, because they refer to some recent news, first of all, regarding the Martinez plant that is apparently poised to be repurposed for renewable energy. And also in California, cars and trucks are said to be largely electric by 2035. So the question is, how much can this transition to renewables be part of the solution? And also, does that leave a lot of business for refineries? And if it doesn't, how much room for a just transition does that allow for?
I'm complimenting the people asking these brilliant questions, and I don't know the answers. They're questions that I have too. Here's what I know so far. There's a limit to how much biofuel, how much like vegetable or animal oils can be turned into stuff you burn in cars, trucks, or jets. There's a natural limit on it that we're getting close to, according to the scientific consensus. And so, to put it bluntly, if we destroy too much of our biodiversity by cutting down too much of the Amazon after displacing the soybeans that we're using for food, we may be seeing mass starvation. That may be the kind of trade-off that we force ourselves into. Not me saying this is global scientific consensus of biodiversity and climate scientists. The other thing to keep in mind is that the really detailed work that's been done on climate technology pathways in California, they're very heavily reliant, in the transportation sector, very heavily reliant on electrified transportation. Which makes a lot of sense, right? An electric car goes 3 times as far per unit energy as a gasoline car. It's just cheaper, and that translates to lower impact, at least in terms of atmospheric emissions. And I'm not saying there's no room for biofuels. Most of the pathways have them, but the Phillips proposal could use up 25% of the total soybean oil production of the US by itself. So when you're talking about scale, these are very large projects. And I put this in the chat, but a big part of the why are they doing this or proposing it? Since about 2018, when the third piece of the subsidy, which is a tax break, got through the Republican Congress, it's dollars per gallon, the total subsidy for refining biofuels. So that much we know.
If I understood the question properly, absolutely there's room for and the need for significant job growth in order to make renewable energy more readily available. We need all the jobs we can get. I mean, the economy I've lived through and grown is totally inequitable. There are not enough opportunities. There are not enough good opportunities. We have reason to believe that building renewable energy infrastructure will produce far more opportunities than the current fossil fuel economy. There is a legitimate question about how good those jobs are, of course, and where those jobs are and that sort of thing. But we need all of that. The trick is to try to manage, again, this from a labor perspective, the trick is to try to manage this change so that we allow communities and workers the ability to manage the change. We could talk at some point about what justice looks like. If you like, I can certainly talk about it from a labor perspective. We haven't gotten into that yet, and it's going to look different if you're a frontline community or somebody else. But certainly, we do need all those jobs. We also need to protect what we have while we can. And refining something, particularly if it's not meant for internal combustion, is an example of that. I would point out that even silicon, which we need for the high-tech industry, needs to be refined. It's a very dangerous process. Workers get killed doing it, but it needs to be refined. So I think there is industrial work to be done. It's our responsibility to manage that process.
Right. Yeah, you know, there are a couple of reports on green jobs in California alone about the number of jobs where they would be. And as Steve pointed out, of course, ensuring worker power to have good jobs is critical. And so that's where the state plays a really big role, but it's also where the federal government plays a big role. And that's why the election, we all know, is extremely important. We have to make it easier to unionize work. We need to raise minimum wages. We need enforcement of health and safety. We need all of that. And we need to actually enforce the laws we have and have some new regulations to really ensure workers' safety and worker power. But we can do that because we see it in Europe. Europe has much, much better regulations of the labor market than we do in the US. And so we know that we can grow the green jobs, and we need to ensure the federal government comes in and provides the regulations to ensure worker power and decent jobs, good jobs. And we can do it. But the elections, we all know, are critical.
Yeah, I wanted to jump back in here because I want to draw out for everybody something that Steve and I were just saying. I was saying, look, the biofuels refining proposals, they're publicly subsidized. That's probably why they're happening, and they're not sustainable in that we're talking jobs for years, not decades, and we're talking about something that, if it was for decades, would probably break our climate. Steve, and I'm going to paraphrase what you said, Steve, because you were so polite and kind. These are jobs. There's hundreds of jobs at stake right now, today, in the Bay Area refining sector. These are people's livelihoods, and the companies are saying that they are going to provide at least some of those jobs through going to this. If we don't have an alternative, then we have allowed the system to put workers and communities in conflict. So this is one of the reasons why this panel decided that one of the types of suggestions that we wanted to advance to you all is a suggestion that avoids that says, here's our just transition alternative. It has to be community or region specific. We need your help with it. We don't do that, then this is what we're experiencing right now is an example of how the chaos that will accelerate can divide us.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so the next question is regarding how exactly do we get an industry like the fossil fuel industry to behave differently? So this person is saying that from what I've seen, no corporations really consider the surrounding community or even their workers when making decisions about closing or growth. And some city councils may actually consider businesses that pay taxes to be constituents with even greater standing than the residents themselves. So any thoughts on that? And yeah, how can we get that industry to again, bring them to that conversation?
Well, take away their markets or regulate them, put limits on their emissions in this case. Take away their markets is hard here if we're talking about refineries because their markets are global for their products, they're exporters. And the state has made the potentially fatal or speciecidal mistake of caving into industry demands that if they do carbon trading, then the refineries don't have any limit on their carbon emissions. So it's what it's what we're all saying is that one of the things we need to do is put government-controlled limits on their emissions that ratchet down. And I'll stop there because I want to let my co-panelists talk.
I suspect the industry has had for some time an outsized influence in local politics, certainly, and perhaps even more so in national politics. There's a lot of political work to be done here if we're going to have representatives in a democracy that pay attention to their constituents at least as much as they do to large corporations. And we've got to do that work. But it still does come back then at some point, to the extent we're able to do that. It comes back to convincing these corporations that they can't have it all their way anymore. And they're going to have to come to the table and play ball if they want to continue to have any of what they expect to have. I don't know any other way to say it other than that. If left to their own ends, they will benefit and we will, all the rest of us, lose.
Yeah, and I really, as an economist, I really agree with Greg that we've got to regulate the emissions and wind them down. But, you know, I also love pricing carbon. I think actually we need every tool possible. We want to price carbon out of existence. We want to really regulate emissions because we care enormously about the local communities. The idea of carbon offsets is a ridiculous idea. But we don't want to give up any of the tools in our toolkit. We want to use every single one of them. And we also want to enforce the law that the fossil fuel companies have to clean up and remediate all of the damage that they've done, so that these aren't trade-offs. I know some of the fossil fuel industry say, oh yeah, give us a carbon tax as long as you don't regulate our emissions. Well, ignore that. You know, we don't let them set the rules now. The government needs to set the rules, and we need to do it in lots of different ways. The market doesn't work well. It's got to be regulated in a way that forces the goals to happen quickly. And so that's why the emissions regulations are critical, along with taxing carbon at a very, very high rate, because then the customers start to see, oh, hey, we really do like renewables. They were a good deal, and now they're a critical deal. But for me as an economist, I don't want to leave any of the tools out of the toolkit that the government can bring to force the transition to be quick and as equitable as possible, and to ensure that also our low-income communities have the money that they need to go EV and to pay for their electricity bills and so forth.
All right, and I think that this is a wonderful segue to the next question, which is in regards to the state legislation. So a really broad question is, are there specific proposals for state legislation? Maybe touch on what level of government can this transition be governed. And one specific bill that was brought up was AB 1839, a broad Green New Deal bill introduced by Rob Bonta that would have set up a just transition task force, and maybe talk about that bill if you have any knowledge of that, or similar state legislation that is currently relevant.
This is Woody. I've had my hand up.
Sure.
The previous conversation, and I think it works segue into the current
Great.
question. I haven't been able to be on the whole time, so maybe this has come up in the conversation. And by the way, sorry I don't have my webcam on, but anyway, I'm Woody Hastings with the Climate Center, and I participate also in a coalition called the Last Chance Alliance, and there's a lot of focus on CalGEM, formerly Dogger, the California Geologic Energy Management Agency, and their new director, Uduak Joe Natuk, and questions revolving around, and you know, this my chiming in was spurred by the question from Sheila around who is really in charge of turning off the oil spigots. And you know, CalGEM, as in relation to the governor, is really where this decision point is where that power lies. And so I don't know if it's already been discussed, because like I said, I wasn't able to be on for the whole conversation, but it would seem to me that we really need to look specifically there at CalGEM and at the governor's relationship to CalGEM, and the degree to which, you know, what kind of marching orders is the governor giving to UDUAC and CalGEM, and that could, you know, I mean, and legislation that we might want to pursue for 2021 could be specifically focused on that. And I would just say, from previous experience with legislation, to try to focus in on something like this in an omnibus type bill that you know, like 1839, that is a sort of a broad sweeping Green New Deal type bill. I'm not so sure that's the good strategy for that. I think this is a very specific, very complicated, focused effort, and I would think that you would want to have a bill and a bill author or authors that and co-authors that are really champions of this particular piece of the puzzle. That's all.
Hey, Woody, good to hear from you. And it is a good question that hasn't been fully covered. I want to try to be brief. All of that work that Woody alluded to really needs to be done. It's part of the solution. It's important. There are so factual and a strategic observation that are really important if we're talking about local community-based action in the Bay Area communities. On the factual side, there are very few oil wells here. There's a big fight out in Brentwood, East Contra Costa County, that I hope you'll all support the community there. But that's almost the exception to the rule. This is an area where the part of the fossil fuel chain that is really entrenched here is refining, that and transportation, and and so, as I did say at the beginning, remember I said that refiners in California refine 3 times the amount of oil that's extracted here, and they're exporting their product internationally. That means that our global role as a state and as a community is crucial. No one else can deal with this part of the fuel chain. No one else has jurisdiction outside of this state. That means we need to target the refineries. That's our responsibility. And conversely, we don't have the jurisdiction. Even if we had political consensus in California, we don't have the jurisdiction across state lines where that oil that's imported is being extracted and where that refined fuel is being cut. So from a strategic standpoint, I guess, those basic facts say something about where we should be focusing our local action. Now, on the statewide level, of course, we should be supporting all those actions, and I do. And here's where I totally agree with you, Woody. I think that we need to be specific enough that we can be enforceable and have broad enough appeal that we can build the political will for state action in a very big state. So I just think we need to start from the grassroots up, or we don't get anywhere.
Right. So Woody and Greg, thank you. Let me go back to the question about the Bonta bill, because I have been involved with the California Green New Deal Coalition, along with my 350 Bay Area Action Team. So the bill got waylaid because it, like everything else, the pandemic and the wildfires took over California lawmakers. And then the budget crisis, there was no money. And we've seen actually with the cap and trade auctions going to almost zero that, at least the state part, we haven't had money to even fund the climate programs that we have in place. So one of the biggest problems is that the bonded bill sort of lays out this idea, but it was going to be like a first step to bring in a whole lot of other legislation to have to obtain specific goals. And one of the biggest problems is funding, so that when you have this budget crisis, it actually will continue evidently for at least a few more years. We need to figure out ways to raise state revenue, not just for education and health, but also for climate. And climate, unfortunately, seems to be the area that's not even being paid much attention to in this discussion. So after this 2020 session ends and we come back, we have to come back and start asking how to fund with bonds, with new taxes that are quite progressive. We need to find the money that does include the climate programs and the funding so that we can go forth with the Green New Deal. But also, let's face it, we need help from Washington. And so once we have a new administration in that is also looking at the equivalent of what it's called the Green New Deal, although I think it might have a new name. The government at the federal level can raise money if we insist they do, because they have a printing press that we don't have in California. And right now, with interest rates almost zero, it pays. Every economist will tell you, actually, it pays to have a deficit right now, and we should, as long as we're using the deficit in a way that builds the new renewable economy that we need, the infrastructure for green economy. And so we know that starting in 2021, we can go forth with what we think of as the Green New Deal. We can find ways to fund it, but it all has to come together. And in California, we definitely have some budgetary problems that we're going to need to deal with.
I just posted the link to the report in the chat in the response to a question. And I should mention that at the same link, under the latest page, you will find the letter from the United Steelworkers, Refinery Workers Union down in LA that I mentioned earlier. And look at their strategy in that letter if you're interested in looking at the money. They're talking about something that they believe is already legally required that could raise in the range of $550 million to several $billion for part of the just transition for jobs and health. And I'm not questioning their figures, but I haven't checked them. But just look at how people in the workforce are talking about it when they talk about just transition and these funding issues that Claire's looking at.
I know I've mentioned it earlier, but I think the Initiative 1631 here in Washington State that we came close to passing in 2018 is an example of how a fee on carbon and the carbon content of fuels can be used to produce the revenue necessary to do all sorts of different things, build the economy, protect workers and communities, all sorts of things. We came awfully close to passing that here. I'm not prepared to give up on that idea. I think it's a great idea. It's an escalating fee on the carbon content of fuels. The fee can go up, or it can flatline, or it can actually go down, depending upon our metrics, you know, whether we're reaching our reduction goals or not.
Yeah.
Came awfully close to passing.
I think it sounds like this panel is in agreement that we ought to be using all of the tools in the toolbox that work together.
Absolutely. And we have a couple more minutes here. So one of the questions that came up, and this was coming up in the chat as well, about a lot of the projects going on in Colorado. And I think as the CEMTF, we do want to take inspiration from other task forces, not just here in California, but across the nation, to really see how we can implement those strategies here. And so the question was, given the increasing decommissioning of fossil fuel sites, can we mobilize the political will to push for a state-level Office of Just Transition, which is currently underway in Colorado?
I'll just say I think we have to, and I think we need to do some work, a lot of work at the grassroots locally to get there.
Yeah, I'm sure that's possible. I'm sure it's necessary. And back to 1631 in Washington State, we were expecting to raise initially up to $1 billion a year. And we intended to have that revenue managed by a couple different committees, an environmental justice committee as well as an economic justice committee, in dozens of different ways to benefit communities all over this state. It's absolutely necessary to do that kind of thing. We have to raise revenue, and we have to manage it properly. Our opponents will tell us it's impossible to do. We know it's not.
Definitely. One question did come up for Greg. Would you consider the closing of the 2 refineries as a big reduction? And can a refinery still produce gas at less than 65% capacity?
Okay, 2 questions. I did show a slide that's relevant to each. There was a slide showing the cumulative emissions change. It was a table, black slide with white. If you guys, any of you want to refer to the slides later, it just shows that the cumulative emission impact of COVID so far has been no more than a blip. Very, very weak signal on the cumulative buildup of emissions, which is what drives climate impact. Of course, the air was cleaner and we saved a few lives along the way. But if you're talking about it from a climate perspective or a long-term perspective, it's a perfect example of the kind of crisis that creates long-term economic damage while doing nothing about long-term environmental damage or making it worse. It's what you think it is. On the second part of the question, Yusra, remind me.
Yes, the second part of the question was, I believe, one second.
Oh, can I go? Yeah.
Yes, at less than 65% capacity.
Yeah, so they're kind of simple hydraulic machines on this level. If the pipe's too big by a little bit, that's all right. If the pipe's too big by a lot, they don't run right. If the pipe's too small, they don't run right. And that's true of the vessels and all of that stuff. So there is a limit. Different refineries are built differently. Most of the ones on the West Coast are old, to some extent, hodgepodges. And they have been upgraded, and the company spent a lot of money to try to make them more flexible, but they have limits. You can see in the slides that I showed that there are much bigger than 25% differences and even bigger than 30% differences in the reductions in gasoline refining rates, in jet fuel refining rates. And for crude, it went down by 33%. And that's from the minimum rate that same week of the year, every year in the past decade. So we're actually talking more like a 40% cut. Some refineries probably couldn't run much below 60%. Many could. But 2 things that I think are actually more important. One is that it's not safe to be ramping up and down and to be running a refinery that in a way that's less stable. They're inherently hazardous anyway. We don't want to be in a situation where we're decommissioning refining rates without also doing the work of resizing the equipment and keeping them safe. And remember, those are workers' jobs, and lots of them. So so I think that you might be able to say that it was not economic, or at least not profitable enough, for Marathon to keep running its refinery at those lower rates. And specifically a bit more profitable because Marathon has two other refineries on the West Coast, one up Steve's Way in Washington and one down in LA. And what Marathon told its investors about shutting down was actually true to some extent, that by running closer to the sweet spot, a little bit higher at their Anacortes and LA refineries, they made more money than if they tried to keep all three of them open, at each one at lower rates. So, that's sort of the dynamics of this. I think if you get down around 75%, then in most cases, the machine just won't run right at all. But it's very site specific. And so a technical answer to maybe what was a practical question.
I think that's basically right, Greg. You've helped people understand the complexity of that simple question. Can it be done? Can gasoline be produced at significantly reduced throughput? Absolutely it can. But it depends a lot on what the feedstocks are and how the plant is designed, and the owner operator's willingness to make a few simple changes if necessary to encourage that or to make it safer. In my experience, it can be done. I've seen it done. I've lived through times where the plant ran at significantly reduced throughput, usually because of fires, explosions, and tragedies, but I've certainly seen that. And I should add here that the reason running these facilities at reduced rates is a reality is because of something that's unique to refining. Refining is unique in comparison to other manufacturing because it takes as many people to run the process units for the most part at 60% of rated capacity as it does at full capacity. It still takes as many people to be safe and to actually operate the plant. And refineries can't be turned off at night. You can't just fire the graveyard shift and start it back up in the morning. They either run or they don't. And that means virtually full employment can be maintained even at reduced rates, significantly reduced rates in many cases. And that's why this is a possibility, a realistic possibility that really would be much more difficult in other kinds of manufacturing. Again, if you're making paper or you're making steel and the market for your product drops, somebody's going to get laid off right away. It's not like that in refining. And these owner operators, they certainly have the money to support that workforce. That's the least of their worries when their markets are in decline.
Right. So yeah. So to just sort of kind of recap, there's a lot of big challenges we face with such a powerful, polluting, hazardous, entrenched industry. But there are some strategic advantages. In California, we can have a global impact to the extent that we can find a way to make it just and feasible to reduce the throughput, the amount of oil going through refineries. And another thing that's really, and that reduces the pollution all along the fuel chain. It's a very powerful opportunity, and it's a huge responsibility that we have to the planet here. The other big strategic thing, and I think Steve is actually right. I did, Steve, see it's actually the Phillips 66 Rodeo refinery, when Union Oil ran it, they did fire the graveyard shift and had guys working like 2 weeks straight, and they blew up their coker. So you're right, can't be done. That literally fell asleep anyway. I laugh now, and fortunately no one was killed in that incident, but it was like a $30 million loss to the company. And they ran it 25%, 30% rate for about 6 months or 3 months. So what I'm getting at is that they are going to need to run efficiently and without blowing themselves up too much. They're going to need workers, and communities and workers that get together have that leverage too. We're going to want them to be doing that, and also to be continuing the maintenance and the resizing as they get smaller, because we can't have them blowing up on us. That's what happened in Philadelphia last year.
Yeah, let me point out, you actually have an advantage there in California. We hope to achieve the same thing here in Washington State. You've already made significant reform regulations with what we call process safety management in your state. We're very close to doing the same here. Those regulations will empower the hourly workforce, the union workforce, and their representatives to play a meaningful role in every aspect of safety in those plants. That's a significant advantage going forward. We should not lose sight of that.
Yeah,
we've never had that until now.
Right. I don't think anyone in this country, have that except California, and I know why. I worked on this with United Steelworkers. Labor and communities got together, and we fought for that for years. That's why we have it.
Well, that's true, and the same dynamic has occurred here. Labor was getting nowhere with Washington State government for 20 years that I know of. But once we built a coalition of community groups and environmental organizations and labor, we finally got their ear, and they're taking it very serious. We have a proposed draft of a new rule that in some cases I think is stronger than California's. It's been delayed now by the virus, but I think we're going to join you in that kind of elite group of states and communities that have taken safety matters into their own hands. And that's going to be very important going forward.
Yeah, so what we didn't win, and this maybe is useful to the groups in the breakout sessions, or as people think about this, what we didn't win in the California process safety one is what's called the safety case. That's jargon for what some other countries, other parts of the world do that have safer refineries than we do in the US or in California. And guess what they do differently? They don't say, hey, we're going to fine you. We're going to slap your wrist with a $1 million fine for a multi-billion-dollar corporation. They say that your permit to continue operations is contingent on you doing this right.
Yeah, they have other advantages there in Europe too. In many cases, here in the United States, we talk about stop work authority. In Europe, they have shutdown authority.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a big deal at Chevron. The operator wanted to shut down the crude unit before it blew up and almost killed 20 workers and sent 15,000 of us to emergency rooms back in 2012. The whole story's longer, but I won't go on. So it's an excellent example of just what's behind our collective call for hard enforced government requirements on these companies' operations.
And I think that there will definitely be space to continue that conversation as we go into our breakouts. I'm really excited. There were so many great questions and great links being dropped in the chat. And I think in the breakout sessions, we will have a much more intimate space to really get to know our ideas. And thank you once again to Claire and Steve and Greg for the really valuable insights and presentations today. So yeah, we will now be going into our breakout sessions. Ruth, I believe, will split us up, and we'll continue that conversation as well. And just make sure, you know, that we're keeping in mind how are we going to embed equity in these strategies. A lot of the issues that the CEMTF is hoping to raise awareness about are often issues that are fueled by racial injustices and severe wealth inequalities in our economy. So keeping that in the back of our minds as we continue this conversation is a really great idea. So yes, we will give it just a few minutes as Ruth breaks us up, and definitely keep the questions and the comments running.
I'm not a Zoom master. Are we going to have to go to a different site, or are we staying here?
You're staying here. So
Okay.
there should have been a little window pop up on your screen.
I'm
So
seeing it now. Breakout room 1, join or not?
Go ahead and join it. Yeah.
Join that one. Okay.
All right. Hopefully all of you had engaging conversations in the breakouts. I think we're just waiting on maybe a few more people to come back. But I first of all want to say a huge thank you to our panelists once again for engaging us this morning, and to all of you for the incredible comments and questions that you've left in the chat. It was very, very insightful, and I think hopefully we can hear a little bit more about what was talked about in the breakouts in the past 30 minutes. Just one quick note is that there is a survey that I just dropped in the chat, so it'd be great if you can fill that out so that we know how we can improve for upcoming summits that we hope to see all of you at in the future. So I think it would be great if, because I actually don't have the order of the breakout rooms at all, but if one group just kind of wants to go ahead and give a short little summary of what they talked about, that would be great. So anybody can feel free to jump in.
I'll jump in.
Or I think, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Lauren.
Okay. So we were definitely really focused on the labor portion, and this sounds obvious in retrospect, but Steve pointed out that all workers create value. The question is, how much of that value do they get? What's their fair share? And obviously unionized workers get a higher share of that. And that's why labor organization and increasing unionized labor is actually really an important part of the environmental just transition movement. And successful initiatives have really had as a base good, strong connections between labor unions and environmental groups and other community groups. And there's a tendency for there to be some misinformation, or that the misinformation campaigns work well, particularly among the rank and file for various reasons. So those relationships need to be broad and deep and very robust. And then the issue for us as organizers is to work with the unions and help them and help all of us push for really formal venues to have these just transition conversations, like what they're doing in Washington, I think it was. So, really have some kind of a commission structure set up so people can explore what needs to be done and how it's going to get funded in some sort of official capacity, including all of the people who need to be involved in those conversations. It was a great conversation. Good job.
Incredible. That's great. And anybody else wants to jump in reporting?
I can jump in.
I can talk about group 4.
Sure. I think Rand was that. I think you had unmuted yourself. So and then was it? I think Steve was next. So Rand, you can go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to put into the chat my notes on this. We really just had a conversation about what to do. One of our folks was like, I don't know where to start. So there was a real discussion about where the work is being done. There's some electoral work. Working America, which is affiliated with AFL-CIO, is doing some get out the vote work. also in Berkeley, the Climate Equity Fund work is going on. But locally, we identified the BACMed Coalition and the Save the Bay Coalition, as well as No Coal in Oakland as places that are engaging. Claire made the point that most of the groups have been working on state legislation. They're shifting now to electoral work with the legislative session ending on Monday. Big shift for a lot of people. And then after that, really kind of to focus on the county level and get some of this stuff going. One of the big things Claire mentioned was asking candidates and politicians not to take money from the fossil fuel industry. That could be huge in California if that got done. I think that's essentially it. You can see the rest in the notes.
Great, and thank you so much for linking your notes in the chat. That's really, really helpful. All right, and as Steve, I think you had also wanted to say something.
Actually, my name's Stu, and our
Okay,
group,
Stu,
yeah,
go ahead.
our group kind of dealt with the part of Greg's talk about and Steve's talk about the gradual movement of getting employees in the refineries to start thinking of getting them educated on this, so that these catastrophic closures won't hit them so hard. And I really think that's a really good point to dwell on, because I was involved years ago with something where the federal government did that, where they shut down a lot of the military bases, and it was done over a 2-3 year period, and the employees were let know right up front that that there was going to be a place for them, and it was done well. We also talked about the role of Newsom in this whole thing. Governor Brown had the big rally in San Francisco, looked like the world's greatest climate person, but Newsom, he's just kind of following in his footsteps, and we think there's a room for a lot more direct action focused on Newsom to adopt this idea of taking Greg's report and getting a just transition plan going for the refineries at the state level, so we can do it kind of work from the bottom up in the communities and the top down from Newsom, I think. The other thing was Contra Costa County. I know I had worked a little bit with John Joya, the supervisor there, who also is on the BACMed board. And I know you guys over in East Bay have been working on him, but I think we need to work on him some more to get the county to address Greg's report and do something about it. I think that was about it on our group.
And Richard, you had your hand up.
Yes, I can go pretty quickly here. We spoke a lot in our group about the issue of the bond that would support local transition. And we had more questions than answers. One of the questions, pretty importantly, was, how would those what's the local authority to create such bonds, and would some statewide legislation be important? And even more importantly, would the statewide legislation facilitate collection of bond funding from all refineries without regard to where it's specifically located? And the idea there is that it makes it a statewide issue. It involves all refineries rather than just one local community and their local refinery. And there was also some concern that suggestion might be a conflict of interest, because those local communities are dependent on the success of the refinery. So to kind of try to use that financial success to fund a local bond issue just seems inherently a conflict of interest. We also had some brief discussion about the issue of local taxes and fees. And I think the main thing that came out of that was, gosh, maybe cities and counties and residents in general need to think about changing their priorities for fees and taxes as an important part of their financial security. And then also, do we need to think about how or what specific items those fees and taxes actually support. And the idea there was, what does a just transition mean in terms of our own individual expectations about what happens in our communities? And I will stop there.
Great. So we do have to return to the main session. We can have one final report back from Jovi.
Okay, so in our discussion, like many others, we focused on this idea of a just transition and how important it was. And we recognized, like Steve said before in his presentation, that this justice looks different for different people. And in order to come towards a more common idea of justice, we have to bring together all these different groups and create like tables for this discussion. And what kind of we can bring to this discussion is that we can bring a sense of urgency about creating action, and we can kind of reinforce this idea that these problems are very real for everyone, though they might affect some people differently, and that we do need to take action fast, and the faster we do this, the easier it will be. So yeah, that's a brief summary.
Perfect. Sounds great. All right. Thank you all so much once again. That was really insightful.